It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Welsh Conservatives leader Andrew R.T. Davies, Labour MP Bel Ribeiro Addy, Daily Mirror editor Alison Phillips, and Deputy Director of the Conservative think tank Bright Blue, Nikita Malik. Today, European Super League is over before it began. Was it people power or political pressure?
Derek Chauvin has been found guilty!
A former police officer is found guilty of murdering George Floyd.
Today, we are able to breathe again.
This can be a giant step forward in the march toward justice in America.
Labour says texts between Boris Johnson and businessman James Dyson are jaw-dropping.
The Prime Minister was doing this not for his own gain. James Dyson wasn't doing this for his own gain. We're doing it in order to ensure that we got these ventilators rapidly in order to ensure that we dealt with a national emergency.
Go ahead all the way in the back.
These daily briefings aren't coming to Westminster. So, what's the £2.6 million briefing room going to be for? Let's start with one of the stories in the headlines, the texts between the Prime Minister and businessman James Dyson. Last year, during the first wave of the pandemic, the Tory-backing businessman Sir James Dyson offered to make ventilators for the NHS. But his firm, which is now based in Singapore, wrote to the Treasury asking for no change in tax status for its staff. In a series of direct text messages between the Prime Minister and Sir James in March 2020, the Prime Minister promised to sort the issue. I will fix it tomorrow. We need you. It looks fantastic. Mr Johnson then follows up to say that Rishi, the Chancellor, has fixed it. When Sir James sought further reassurance for the tax status of his firm, Mr Johnson replied, "James, I am First Lord of the Treasury, and you can take it that we are backing you to do what you need." Andrew, some of our viewers will look at those text messages and think, well, the access only a wealthy businessman like James Dyson could possibly have to the Prime Minister. And as Labour says, it's jaw-dropping.
No, this is a senior industrialist who had the capability to responding in a national crisis to an emergency situation where we needed ventilators. I think what's important to reflect on the lobbying inquiry that's ongoing at the moment are the comments of Eric Pickles in particular, who gave evidence before the House of Commons committee last week, and act on those comments. And that's what will be the true test here. But ultimately, this was in the middle of the pandemic where ventilators were required. James Dyson is one of the major industrialists in this country. And you'd expect, obviously, that engagement with government who's commissioning those ventilators to be made to save lives here in the United Kingdom.
I mean, Bel, it's perfectly reasonable, isn't it? It's what people would expect the Prime Minister to do everything in his power to secure life-saving equipment in the midst of a pandemic.
Well, yes, absolutely. The Prime Minister should do that, but there should be checks and balances as to how we do it. There are a number of members of Parliament, I remember, towards the beginning when we had this issue with the ventilators and with PPE, who got up and spoke about businesses in their constituencies that were ready to provide these things but had not heard back from the government. I suspect a number of them didn't have the Prime Minister's personal mobile number to be able to send text messages to get bumped up the list.
Right. I mean, Nikita, listening to all of that, do you think it underlines, though, in people's mind, the sense that there are different sets of rules depending who you are and how rich you are?
Well, no, I don't think that. And I think this shows certain aspects of lobbying that perhaps need more transparency. Lobbying is the backbone of politics. We can't stop people from talking to each other, from reaching out to the connections they need to get the job done very quickly. But as we've seen with Grensill and Cameron's texts as well, this should be done through a formal mechanism where there's transparency and the public is aware of it, rather than through text messages. And I think inquiries in this way will reflect improvements to ensure that this is done going forward, rather than, back doors. This is done through formal processes. But of course, during a pandemic, this might have had to be escalated. But it does bring up a lot of questions about lobbying and the nature of it in British politics today.
Alison, what did you make of Tony Blair, the former Labour Prime Minister's reaction? He said he found it hard to get worked up about these reports of this personal text exchange between the two of them, and said that actually the Prime Minister needed a certain degree of understanding given the crisis it found itself in.
Well, I do think we have to put it into the context of this time last year when we'd seen all those pictures of people dying in Italy, and we were absolutely terrified that the same thing was going to be here and that we wouldn't have the ventilators to treat them. So it was a national emergency. But at the same time, it is also, it highlights again that there is this system here, as we said, that rich industrialists, particularly rich Brexit supporting industrialists who have always had a very close eye, as Dyson has, on reducing his tax liabilities, were able to get a text message into the Prime Minister, and then the Prime Minister, sort of channeling his inner Jimmy Savile, comes back and says, don't worry, I'll fix it, Boris will fix it. And I think it's just coming now after everything we've seen with David Cameron and his texts to Rishi Sunak, and it's just this general sense that some people have got greater access than other people, and it just doesn't feel right. And
we're going to return to this story throughout the programme. Of course, we have Prime Minister's questions coming up at noon. But let's turn to another story that has really dominated the media and the airwaves over the last 48 hours. Let's take a look at the headline in the Daily Mail. Football's civil war, defeat of greed. And this is how it was covered in Alison's paper, the Daily Mirror. New hope for football, you're not singing anymore. You're then referring to the European Super League that does seem to have somewhat fallen apart before it had really even got going. Alison?
Well, I mean, I think it's incredible. I mean, we've just seen this morning the apology from John Henry, the owner of Liverpool, who is saying that it's a heartfelt apology. We never thought that we would upset the fans. I think what's really interesting about this is how little understanding these billionaire owners have of their fans and of the people in this country and across Europe and what they feel about football. And I think it's part of a wider issue about so much power now is in the hands of a tiny elite who are totally out of touch with the masses. They don't understand that doing something like this could be a problem.
Right, but Alison, do you think it was about outrage from the fans or political pressure?
No, I think it was absolutely about outrage from the fans, because you've got to understand that these rich billionaires only understand one thing, and that is money. And they don't think about the fans, they think about consumers. And so if you're a Liverpool fan, you're a Liverpool consumer, you spend your money on Liverpool products. And as soon as they saw that the toxic nature of what they had created was going to be really damaging for their brands, they had to get out of there. And I mean, the harsh reality is national governments now have very little power to control the actions of these huge billionaires. And yes, you know, there could have been attempts to do so, and Boris was talking about his legislative bomb, but really it's the people that changed this.
Do you agree with that? Do you agree with that, Andrew? Do you think it was sort of people power and people pressure, or the threat of legislation and regulation?
I think it's a combination of the two, and I think there's a genuine win here, both for the fans and also the political power that rode in very quickly to sort this out in virtually 48 hours from when the news broke. Because obviously there was some big vested interest here pushing this Super League that was promoted with clubs across Europe forming the elite division that could have been so harmful to the pyramid system that we see here in the UK. But ultimately, the real beneficiaries here will be the fans themselves, because this time round, they really have come through and fan power has won through the arguments of the day. And it's great to see that the UK government has set up a commission to look into this under Tracy Crouch, who knows her football inside out. I had a great amount of work with her on safe standing when she was the sports minister, and I have a huge regard for her because she ultimately understands how football's run in this country.
Belle?
Definitely victory for the fans. They made it a point to push politicians, and I suppose the clubs were actually probably calling our bluff, thinking that, you know, they could go ahead and do whatever they want, but the fans have shown that football is their game. It is our national sport, and they ultimately have won.
Right.
But I think we need to look moving forward how we take all of this power out of the hands of owners, because we could end up in a situation like this again.
Right, and we will look at the policy response a little later. It may well be brought up at PMQs. Nikita, did the government take a gamble? Because they made a very big stand. It was a big intervention. Some might have thought unlikely for a Conservative government intervening in private companies. How did you see it?
Well, I thought it was amazing, actually, to see the power of collective action and how quickly, clubs were made to kind of stand down because of this collective action. And I think there are kind of two important lessons to be learned from this. The first is that football is not just about the economics, it's about the social fabric of society. A lot of these local clubs, the underdog, it gives you the opportunity to work your way up in these games, and people's loyalty to these clubs were really shown through that fan base. And the second is also the fan supporter base in the running of these clubs. In Germany, there's much more kind of collective fan base involved in how clubs are operated and run. And I think this is a very important time for reflection as to how fans can, really shape the way that their clubs do business. And ensure that it's more than just the bottom line. It's their love of the game that's reflected as well.
All right, well, let's leave it there just for the moment, because it was an important, historic day in the United States yesterday as a jury in Minneapolis delivered guilty verdicts on charges of murder and manslaughter in the case of Derek Chauvin, the former police officer who was filmed pressing his knee on the neck of African-American George Floyd for more than 9 minutes. This is how the Washington Post covered it there on its front page. Chauvin convicted on all counts. This is the moment when those guilty verdicts on Derek Chauvin were handed down by the judge in the courtroom. Let's take a look.
We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty.
Guilty! That's all one count, though. We got 2 more. Derek Chauvin's been found guilty! Derek Chauvin has been found guilty!
Well, you can see and hear the crowds of supporters who had been waiting for the verdict after a day of deliberation. We can talk to the BBC's Washington correspondent, Gary O'Donoghue, who joins us from George Floyd Memorial Square. Gary, how big a moment is this for America?
Well, I think people are really seeing it as the most important, certainly the most important trial of a police officer in respect of a black man since Rodney King in the early 90s, and really a kind of a seminal moment, along with things like Selma, Alabama. That sounds like a big claim, but that's something that the NAACP here is suggesting, that this is that kind of moment. But I think everyone also recognises that it is just a moment in that sense, and that it's what flows from now that's important. And that would require huge systemic change, and the nature of policing in this country is such that it's so devolved down to individual police departments, individual states, that getting anything changed on a national level is incredibly hard. There is legislation in front of Congress to restrict the liability claims that officers can rely upon when they get into these sorts of situations. But there's such partisanship in Washington that it's very hard to see some of that national legislation going through at all.
Right. I mean, talk us through some of the reaction that there's been to the result, to the verdicts, Gary, and whether or not there is a sense, following on from what you say, that it will heal divisions in any sense in the country.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Biden, of course, phoned the family immediately afterwards, and then, went on television and said that this was a moment of significant change, and that's what he's hoping for. And that's a pretty big deal and a pretty big promise to come from the White House. You had President Obama saying this was, that true justice would require much more than this. I mean, it is incredibly rare to get a white police officer convicted in these circumstances. We know that. So in that sense, this is one of those moments. But the question for everyone is what to do next about that change, how to bring that change about. And there are a lot of divisions over that. Defunding the police was one call from parts of the progressive left. In other words, taking money away from police departments, funneling it into other community projects. That is not going to fly nationally. There's been talk about, banning chokeholds, as I said before, and also about, reducing the protections, the legal protections that police officers have when they go about their job. All these are highly controversial. None of them actually get at the underlying attitudinal issues and the underlying difficulty that America has with race as an issue going back generations, going back all the way to the founding of the Republic.
Gary, thank you very much. Gary O'Donoghue there for us for the BBC in Minneapolis. Belle, can I start with you? Do cases like this with America and the world watching result in real change?
Well, we certainly hope that they do. I mean, it would seem that justice was done on this occasion, and it's definitely, a crucial verdict. But we have to recognise that real justice would have been George Floyd being alive, and real justice will ultimately be a situation where Black people do not die at the hands of the police, do not die as a result of state violence. That would be ultimate justice. So it's one case. It is historic. It is monumentous, because I don't believe it's happened before. To my knowledge, I don't believe any white police officer has ever been convicted for the death of a Black person, especially even regardless of the circumstances, even though we know that things like this have happened since George Floyd was murdered.
Right, yes, I think you're right. Nikita's nodding her head too. But Nikita, what about this issue of real change? It is a moment, as Gary said, a historic moment, and pretty well everyone will agree. But who will drive the change in police forces across the United States?
Yes, I think this is a very important question, and it needs to come from the structures and institutions themselves, and the change needs to be driven by government. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the Sewell report in our country, but it's had a few very important recommendations for police stop and search. The first is that the police need to wear body cameras that need to be on during stop and search. They need to take de-escalation training to ensure that situations don't lead to harm. And the third is that they require more community input into the way that policing is run, community groups inputting into this. So we need to see reform from the bottom, and a very important part of this, and I absolutely agree. I think it is a fact that this is the first time that a white policeman has been convicted in this way for a crime like this, which has happened many times in the United States. We need to look at improvements in the system. This happened because somebody caught it on camera. And so therefore, the use of body cameras with written explanations and very rare instances of body cameras not being used during stop and search can really help. If I could quickly add as well, in the Sewell report, there is the kind of the drugs, the possession of certain types of Class B drugs being removed. And so therefore people who possess them don't have a criminal conviction. They're instead, they don't have this criminal record, will also lead to a de-escalation of violence. And that has been the case in Portugal since they implemented this many years ago. And it has actually statistically led to a reduction in arrests and a reduction in violence because of the possession of Class B drugs being, not criminalized in this way. So they're very important, I think, policy recommendations to be looked at. And that is what we need to be doing going forward is real change, timely change on the ground, rather than, big ideas.
Well, Alison, it's a huge story. It will continue to be so. But as Nikita has said, will it result in huge policy change in the United States, do you think?
Well, I think now that we've got a president who, as you said earlier, immediately telephoned the family, immediately went on television and said that this is time for a great leap forward. Now, there is a will there from the very top to make change. But of course, as Gary O'Donoghue was saying, it's very difficult in America where you have so much power in the individual states. But as Nikita was saying, there are things that can be done, that just training the de-escalation of violence, training around how to deal with these situations. I mean, only hours after the verdict last night, there was a 16-year-old girl, a black girl, was shot dead in the States. So this is going on all the time. But the police authorities in the United States have got to realise that it is in their best interest to start policing with the consent of the people who they are serving, and to start reframing the whole of their policing policies.
Andrew?
Well, I think the big question here is how that change is going to be driven, because as we heard from Gary's piece before we all started making our contributions, the complexities of law enforcement in the United States are many, many layers of different levels of government with different levels of responsibility. And what's really important from this verdict is that that change agenda is driven forward. We have a president, obviously, in the White House now who's determined to do this, but we've seen time and time again the power of the states and the power of local government, in particular in the states, to stop the federal change that maybe the president would wish to enact. And so it's striking that balance between the states and the federal government to drive the improvements that we all want to see. Because let's not forget, the situation we find ourselves in today is because George Floyd tragically lost his life in one of the most horrendous circumstances you could think, pleading for his life.
Right, and as we've been talking about, we will watch to see what change comes about in the United States. But George Floyd's death sparked protest marches in other parts of the world, including here in the UK. Many of the protesters, as we can see here, marched as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And in response to that, the UK government established the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities under the chairmanship of Tony Sewell. The commission was set up to investigate race and ethnic disparities across the UK. Now, they reported in March, and it provoked something of a backlash. We can see a headline here in the Independent newspaper: "No proof of institutional racism, claims key report, but official review finds overt discrimination persists in the UK." Now, that backlash was addressed by the Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, in the House of Commons yesterday. Let's just play you part of what she said.
It is true that this landmark analysis challenges a number of strongly held beliefs about the extent and influence of racism in Britain today. The commissioners have followed the evidence and drawn conclusions which challenge orthodoxy, and they were prepared for robust and constructive debate. However, they were not prepared for the willful misrepresentation of the report which occurred following its publication. This government welcomes legitimate disagreement and debate, but firmly rejects bad faith attempts to undermine the credibility of this report.
But what do you make of the charge of willful ignorance and bad faith outlined there by the Minister?
Well, I think that's an absolutely disgraceful way to characterise it. The fact remains that the people that this report affects, and not all of them, nobody claims to speak for every single ethnic minority in this country, but looking at the backlash to the report, looking at all of the different organisations, who they represent, the individuals, the commissioners themselves, saying that Number 10 rewrote the report, people that gave evidence to the report saying as far as they're concerned, institutional racism exists. It is clear that this report is rejected widely. It is even clearer that it is rejected by those that it's meant to impact, by those it is about. And in that way, I was quite shocked the minister would double down and push ahead with this report, claiming, different people supported it, and on that basis, she would. I just don't understand how you can impose something like this on a population of people, Black, Asian and minority ethnic people, who do not believe in it, who do not accept it, and who have actually been calling for many, many years to implement the recommendations of various reports that have gone past.
Nikita?
Yes, I mean, I just kind of contextualized the segment you played there. I think Kemi was responding in particular to being, to the reference of gatekeepers, that they are ethnic minorities who are gatekeepers. And I think that was very offensive, because it implies that ethnic minorities who don't agree with a certain point of view are gatekeepers to government, or the reference she made was what provoked that response. Now, I would just look at, beyond the headlines, some of the recommendations put forward in the report, which I mentioned previously: stop and search body cameras, extending the school day for disadvantaged children, ensuring that online hate and racism targeted towards ethnic minorities is tackled by tech companies. Looking at aspects to do with BAME and coupling a number of different ethnic groups together. They're real, tangible recommendations here to do with the workplace as well, moving beyond box ticking exercises to do with unconscious bias, and actually looking at hiring policies or CV blind policies and how effective they are. So my opinion on this is that the actual, substance of the report, parts of it are very nuanced, can actually be implemented and make change on the ground, and that has been lost because of these headline grabbing things from organizations like the United Nations working groups that are saying that this report is a white supremacist report. So it completely loses the fabric of what the report is trying to convey.
Do you accept that, Belle?
No, I don't accept that, and the reason why I don't accept it is because, yet again, it's the individuals that this report is specifically about, with organizations that support them, and as individuals, academics, Dr. Marmont, I believe, who had written a report previously about this, Professor Marmont, sorry, and so many others have come forward to reject this report and reject its ultimate premise. And in doing that, they're saying, as the people that experience this, we're saying it's wrong. Now, I know that they were Black and Asian and ethnic minority people that wrote the report. Yes, but that doesn't absolve, as far as I'm concerned, the views of the majority. No, we are not all one homogenous group. We do not all think exactly the same thing. You will see that from the exchanges that a number of Black members of the Labour Party may have with the Equalities Minister, at the time, who is also Black. We don't always agree, but we're talking about what are the views and what are the well-held, well-researched, well-founded views of Black, Asian and minority ethnic people within this country already. So to completely refute that through this report and, to effectively gaslight those that are not, in agreement with the idea that there is no institutional racism is wrong in itself. Denying that institutional racism exists in itself is a form of institutional racism.
Nikita?
Yes, I disagree with that. I don't think that the report denied institutional racism exists. I think there was a page where it actually talked about different types of racism, and the concern is that if we don't define institutional racism,
but it was very clear about saying, as far as they're concerned, there was no evidence of institutional racism, and that is what people have picked up. No one's saying they denied that racism exists.
Yeah,
I think they said that institutional racism doesn't exist,
Nikita?
And that's wrong.
Let me just read the quote, if you don't mind. I'll just interject briefly. The report doesn't deny racism exists. The commissioners explicitly state, we take the reality of racism seriously and we do not deny that it is a real force in the UK. But another part of the report, it is 258 pages long, says, put simply, we no longer see a Britain where the system is deliberately rigged against ethnic minorities. Nikita?
Yeah, I think I would broadly agree with the fact that there are issues here. The first is by just using that term, BAME. The experiences of the people, the different minority ethnic groups within these groups are so vast that coupling them together is quite problematic. And that's one of the issues. The second issue here is precisely what you said. Minority ethnic groups have had very different experiences. And to use, frankly, racist language like gatekeepers, House Muslims, worse things like that for people who, express opinions that are different. I think that is what the minister was responding to in particular in the statement in the clip that we played. So I think, in my opinion, there are specific recommendations in this report when we talk about change. What are the other options? If we're boycotting these changes, what are the alternatives? It seems to be that people are binning this report without
that have gone past. There have been so many different reviews into race and racism. The Lammy review, the Macpherson review, which we never ended up implementing in full. So many different reviews and inquiries have gone past with recommendations that were widely accepted by Black, Asian and minority ethnic people across this country.
For example, what policies are you referring to, Belle?
Well, the McPherson review was very, very clear. And there were things that we started to implement in terms of recording ethnicity under this government that's got a lot lower in different sectors right across society. We're looking at the Lamy review and some of the recommendations when it comes to justice, looking at stop and search and different things such as that. Now, there are so many different things that have pointed out very clear institutional, structural racism within this country and clear recommendations to get out of it. Instead, we have a new report which says it doesn't exist and, we're looking at these different measures. So the recommendations are there, absolutely fine. But I think we need to understand what the government are saying. If they are saying there is no institutional racism, there is nothing then for the state to actually do. There's no fault on the state. So they're simply outsourcing it again.
All right,
well,
let me get Nikita to respond to that specifically, and I'll bring the others in. Are they literally trying to dismiss their responsibility, Nikita, the government here?
No, I don't think we would have had a report of over 200 pages if they were trying to dismiss their responsibility on this. We wouldn't have had so many, I think, quite plausible and nuanced recommendations that can be implemented on the ground to improve things like stop and search, to improve things like the criminalization of the possession of Class B drugs, to increase the school day for disadvantaged children in particular. I think they're bias in the workplace as well. So I think they are specific recommendations here that if institutional racism didn't exist, they wouldn't be there. And we also, need to recognize that, and I think the report tries to, that the generations of individuals in ethnic minority communities today are very different from those of their parents or grandparents. So therefore, the standards of what they need and what they require are different. A review done many years ago.
All right. I think Nikita mentioned the United Nations Working Group report, Andrew, on people of African descent. And it said on Monday that the report's conclusion, the one done here, on institutional racism was an attempt to normalise white supremacy. What can you say to that?
Well, I disagree with that. I mean, the Commission provided a comprehensive report of some 250 pages plus. It didn't say that there was no institutional racism. It said the term should be deployed more carefully. And it reflected on 4 streams of work it believed needed to be taken forward by government to obviously improve the situation. And it identified racism in various aspects of our society. But it also pointed out to the successes that have been built into society over the last 20, 30 years. And as the Minister said, all the commissioners stand by that report. I think I heard a little earlier in the contributions that someone was trying to say that the commissioners refuted the report that had their name carried to it.
Right, I think it was one of the contributors, but Professor Marmot, I think, is who Bell was referring to.
I think it's important to reflect on that the commissioners stand by this report, as the Minister highlighted in a statement to the House yesterday. And what's really important now is obviously the government's response to the report and the recommendations. But there has been progress. Is there more work to do? Of course there's more work to do. Is there success in the field? Yes, there is success. But let's highlight that success as well as the challenges so that we can all measure the progress to what we want to get to as an inclusive society.
Right, and on the recommendations then, Alison, I mean, it looks as if the government is going to accept this report.
Yes, I mean, the whole report really, it feels really sort of quite depressing. You look at how this has played out from when we came out of Black Lives Matter last summer, when there was a real desire to look at, okay, where are we as a country? And where have we made progress and what do we need to do? And then we seem to have come at the other end of this report and really it seems to have made a really difficult situation even worse. I mean, there's all the issues around how the report was put together, where some bits and pieces cherry-picked that weren't sort of full quotes, weren't entirely accurate. And then the way it was then released, which the way it was projected was that nothing to see here, there's not a problem. And I think that sort of anger from people who just felt that they were not being heard and they were just being told to shut up and that they were imagining things. I mean, as Belle said, this was a sense of being gaslighted. You're mad even think there's any form of institutionalised racism here. So now that may not have been what the report's authors wanted, but when you're dealing with these kind of reports, you've got to think about the perception of how what you are producing is going to be seen. And unfortunately, it's done so much damage that, yes, there are, as Nikita said, there's some very interesting recommendations in that report, and I do hope that they are implemented. But in the doing of that, they have created even more problems.
All right, we're going to leave it there just for the moment. I want to move on to something that our guest, Belle Ribeiro-Addy, took part in on Monday. She spoke in a Westminster Hall debate about black maternal health care and mortality and talked about her own experience. Let's have a listen.
Things went from bad to worse for me. I was swollen, my blood pressure would get so high, I would feel dizzy, my nose would bleed. My doctor eventually had me rushed to the hospital for further tests and scans. Now I'd admitted into hospital with preeclampsia. My last conversation with the consultants was harrowing. They said my pregnancy had become very dangerous and there were only two outcomes. My child would die, or both myself and my child would die. My diagnosis was too late for any intervention, and the simple steps, which I soon found were simple things such as taking aspirin. This was no longer an option for me. Their advice was for a late termination and a delivery to save myself. A scan scheduled the next day after that meeting showed that my baby's heart had stopped beating. I was induced, and after something like 18 hours of labour, she was born. As a person of faith, even then, I still had faith that maybe the doctors were wrong and everything would be okay. But she did not move, she did not cry, and there was no miracle.
Very moving, Belle, and difficult, I should think, to talk about. What made you want to share your personal experience?
I really wanted people to listen. At the moment, we have a situation where in this country, black women are 4 times more likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth. Women of mixed heritage are 3 times more likely, and Asian women are 2 times more likely. That's completely wrong. We've seen throughout the pandemic, the majority of women being admitted who are pregnant with COVID-19 were also from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. We've seen declining standards of care, and we're seeing so many women who actually go on, like myself, to suffer what's called a near miss. And you've got an increased chance, if you are of African heritage like myself, an 83% increased chance of suffering a near miss, and an 80% increased chance of suffering a near miss if you are of Caribbean heritage. Those figures are staggering. And the report that we just discussed said that the figures were too low to be considered, for race to be considered in that way, and we need to look at other factors. And I found that offensive, and so did many other black women who have been through what I have been through. There is a clear issue with racial bias in the way in which we provide maternal services in this country, and we need to change that. And we're not going to change that by not acknowledging it in the first instance because we want to seem like we're better and we're so great when it comes to race in this country. We need to acknowledge the disparities, and then we need to have a target to end it. I was so disappointed by the minister's response, which was, yes, this is very bad, but we need to look into it a bit more before we set any targets. So these things are happening, but we have no target to end it. We've known about it for years, but we have no target to end it.
OK, Alison?
Women are dying.
Alison?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was heartbreaking when I heard Belle speaking the other day. I mean, the target point is absolutely crucial. I mean, there's absolutely no reason not to have a target. There's no good reason why they couldn't just say, right, OK, we will try and halve those numbers of women that are dying in pregnancy and childbirth. We'll try and within the next 5 years. I mean, and then at least there is something to work towards. But by not setting a target, and it appears again that we're not listening to people who are coming forward and saying, this is my lived experience, this is my life, this is what's been happening to me, and thereby dismissing those people. And how are we ever going to progress as a society if we just won't listen?
Right. I mean, Andrew, I know that healthcare is devolved, but listening to this and listening to the staggering figures, I mean, are you shocked that something isn't being done in terms of a target or setting some sort of goal for health services to reach?
Well, the example of Belle in that debate was very moving, and ultimately that personal experience is what politics is about at the end of the day, bringing those personal experiences to the places that can make a big difference. And as you said, health is devolved responsibility. And when you hear those numbers, 4 times greater risk of dying in childbirth, then you need to respond to that. And it is important that you do set the system up to make sure that you respond when that evidence is emerging, to put the safety net in place, because childbirth is meant to be the most joyous experience that an individual or a family can go through. And then suddenly it's put into stark terms when you have such a tragic event as we just heard about.
Nikita?
Yeah, I mean, I just hearing that, I'm just so sorry that happened to you, and that continues to happen to minority ethnic women and women as well. I think there's a lot. I don't see why there isn't a target. I think personal experiences do, as we said, do really kind of reiterate the need for targets. But I also think that there's work to be done in terms of education. I mean, I was reading broader numbers that 1 in 3 pregnancy-related deaths are due to heart conditions and stroke. So there's better, patient care that needs to be done at the very beginning, and better patient care that needs to be done after delivery as well, because the majority of childbirth, deaths happen between a week and a year of giving birth. So aftercare as well is a very important area where this kind of needs to improve, not just the delivery, but even the year after care.
Right.
So I think women's voices and particularly minority ethnic women's voices need to be heard to really improve some of these processes.
Right. Well, Belle, the final word from you after that powerful, moving discussion in terms of a target. Are you heartened by the fact that there is consensus here, at least, that should be in place?
Yes, I am. I'm quite surprised, as I know there are representatives from different parties here, that I just believe that there needs to be some sort of action. To say that we need to spend more time looking into it seems to be the issue that happens whenever we talk about matters of race. But I'm glad that there are others that believe that there should be some sort of target. And more importantly, that Black women need to be listened to. A lot of women that do describe their experiences, a lot of it comes down to them not being listened to. And we know from studies that show that Black women are perceived to be, by all medical professionals across the board, to have to suffer from less pain, things like that those sorts of biases that we need to root out of every section of our society, not least our healthcare.
All right. It's a few minutes now till PMQs at midday. And at this point, of course, in the programme, we welcome the BBC's political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. There we go. There's the chamber. Take a quick look inside. Of course, social distancing continuing in line with COVID rules. Laura, you broke the story about the texts that we talked about at the very beginning of the programme between the Prime Minister and the businessman James Dyson. Why is this such a big problem? And, how does it play into the wider debate around lobbying and access?
I think it's been a problem for successive governments, successive civil servants, successive businesses, charities, unions, all of those people who try to get involved in the discussions around how government spends billions of pounds and how they change millions of people's lives. I think this story emerging is politically problematic for 2 reasons. Number one, the Prime Minister has spent the last couple of weeks saying, goodness me, we must have a look at this. We must do things all above board and look at what happened with the former Prime Minister and look at what happened with some former civil servants. We must investigate this. And there are several investigations going on into what happened with the former Prime Minister, David Cameron, and his links to the now failed financial company. I think the second problem in all of this, that while we must bear in mind the context in which this exchange was taking place, the beginning of the pandemic, and a lot of people might think, good on them, they were trying to sort out a problem. In many people's minds, and in Boris Johnson's political critics' minds, this just looks like it is too close for comfort. Because what we have here is the most powerful politician in the country appearing to give personal assurances about changes to government policy when it came to the tax rules. But I think it's one of these stories that it will depend a lot on the ear of the beholder. Some people will look at it in very, very different ways, but it puts Downing Street in the frame in what has been a very vigorous discussion about serious concerns about the relationships between government and how it does transactions with the outside world.
Well, and as you say, last week, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, went on questions around a former Prime Minister. This week, he will perhaps ask questions about the current Prime Minister in terms of those texts. Absolutely. I mean, as you say, in terms of who's listening to it and what they already think about the situation, does this have cut through with the general public, or will the justification, as the government sees it, that we were in the middle of a pandemic, so normal rules don't apply? I mean, I don't think they've said that, but what I mean is that what people will think?
They've hinted in a sense. I mean, their defence to this is not to say, oh, the Prime Minister followed every single rule. They haven't said that. What they have said is the circumstances at the time were so frantic and people were trying very hard at speed to do the right thing. What's interesting is that Labour have seized onto this issue. Actually, some months ago, they were talking a lot about PPE contracts, about Conservative donors somehow being given preferential treatment. And I think for a long time, it looked like something that wasn't really getting anywhere. What Labour insiders will tell you now is that this is starting to cut through, and they are hearing back suggestions of concerns about Tory sleaze when they conduct focus groups, or even when they've heard from people on the doorsteps direct during local campaigning. Now, in one sense, they would say that, wouldn't they? However, Keir Starmer, as he did last week, we saw he was trying to sort of reflate that ghost of Tory sleaze. The situation's very different to 30 years ago, but Labour believes they are onto something. Ultimately, of course, our audience and voters are the ones who will make their minds up.
We haven't got long, Andrew, but can you respond to that? Are you worried that Labour's charge of sleaze will stick?
Well, as I said in the opening remarks I made, it's about context. And we were in the middle of the start, in fact, of the pandemic. And did people want respirators and ventilators to make sure that we could deal with the challenges that the scenes in Italy were showing us? And it is a fact that obviously civil servants advise, politicians decide. And when you need to make these quick decisions, surely that's where you need the interaction between the politicians. And it would seem as if the correct approaches were done in the first instance through the Treasury, but ultimately the decision maker is the Prime Minister, and that speedy return of remarks and answers to questions allowed for ventilators to come forward, and people wanted to see those ventilators to deal with the crisis that was unfolding before us.
Right. Well, Alison, do you think the charge will stick?
Yeah, I think we are hearing it on doorsteps that people who are campaigning at the moment. There's just something just feels a little bit not great at the moment about a lot of this stuff that's going on. And I completely take the point about the ventilators. At that point, it was a national emergency, but it just all feels a little bit too cosy.
All right, I think we're going to have to end it there. I can see the Prime Minister just taking his seat. I can't quite hear what the Speaker... no, we're beginning. Here's Prime Minister's questions. Thank you to my guests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that the whole House will want to join me in sending our very best wishes to Her Majesty the Queen on her 95th birthday. Mr. Speaker, last night's verdict in Minneapolis delivered justice for the family and friends of George Floyd, and I know that the thoughts of the whole House remain with them. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the decision taken by the 6 English football teams not to join the European Super League. The announcement was the right result for football fans, for clubs and for communities across the country. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Let's go to Ronnie Cowan. Ronnie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. May I extend my good wishes to the Queen today in what must be difficult times. I hope she finds she's surrounded by friends and family, and she can find it within herself to take some time to celebrate her 95th birthday. I know the Prime Minister is not a supporter of basic income, but given that Hull, Belfast, Norwich, Leeds, Lambeth, Guildford, Swansea and Glasgow, along with 24 other councils around the United Kingdom, have expressed a desire to run pilot schemes which will enhance all our knowledge of the pros and the cons, will the Prime Minister consider facilitating any pilot projects in the United Kingdom? And has the UK government considered any research into basic income? And if so, what?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful to the honourable member for his support for a UK-wide proposal. And I trust he understands the irony of that when you consider, Mr. Speaker, that his party, as I understand it, is still hell-bent on calling an irresponsible referendum on breaking up the United Kingdom.
Dr. Luke Evans. Luke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as we come out of lockdown and look to the summer, many people are going to be concerned about their body image. And we know that there are 1.25 million people who suffer with eating disorders and 1 million people using steroids, and that number's getting worse. The Women and Equalities Committee 2 weeks ago released a report on body image, and they concluded that, I quote, doctored photos promoting unachievable body images were having a detrimental impact. So would the Prime Minister consider all options, including labelling digitally altered images, to help deal with the issues raised of body image?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is raising a very important point, and I think he and the whole House are aware of the pressure that young people in particular can feel as a result of doctored images, and as part of the online advertising, the consultation on the online advertising programme, we will look at what we can do, and I know that we will be responding to the Select Committee's report in due course.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in wishing Her Majesty a very happy birthday? The last few weeks have been a time of incredible personal anguish. We all send Her Majesty and the royal family our very best wishes. Can I also join the Prime Minister in his comments about the verdict in the George Floyd case, justice in that case? And even as an Arsenal season ticket holder, can I join him in his comments about the European Super League, which would have destroyed football, and we now need to get on with the other changes that are necessary. And finally, Mr. Speaker, can I also send my condolences to the family of Frank Judd, who died earlier this week. Frank was a much-loved member of this House and the other place for many decades, and highly respected as a Labour minister, a great internationalist and campaigner for peace and human rights, and he will be sadly missed. What does the Prime Minister think is the right thing to do if he receives a text message from a billionaire Conservative supporter asking him to fix tax rules?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I echo the Right Honourable Gentleman's remarks about Frank Judd. And can I say to him, in response to his question, that if he's referring to the request from James Dyson, I make absolutely no apology at all, Mr. Speaker, for shifting heaven and earth and doing everything I possibly could, as I think any Prime Minister would in those circumstances, to secure ventilators for the people of this country and to save lives and to roll out a ventilator procurement, which the Labour-controlled Public Accounts Committee themselves said was a benchmark for procurement.
Mr. Speaker, let's be clear what these texts show. The Prime Minister was lobbied by a wealthy businessman and a close friend for a change in the tax rules. Tax rules. The Prime Minister responded, "I'll fix it." Then, after a discussion with the Chancellor, who everybody seems to be lobbying these days, the Prime Minister texted his friend to say, "It's fixed." How many other people with the Prime Minister's personal number has he given preferential treatment to?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I recall the Right Honourable Gentleman at the time saying that we should do everything that we could to get more ventilators, and indeed he congratulated the rollout of the ventilator. He said that well done to everybody involved for the ventilator challenge. And I just remind the House what we were facing in March last year, Mr. Speaker, which was that we had a new virus which was capable of killing people in ways that we didn't understand. The only way to help them in extremis was to intubate them and put them on ventilation. We had 9,000 ventilators in this country, Mr. Speaker. We secured 22,000 as a result of that ventilator challenge. I think it was entirely the right thing to do, to work with all potential makers of ventilators at that time, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, so does the former leader of the Labour Party, a man to whom I think he should listen, Tony Blair.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised the Prime Minister brings up former leaders, since it's his former leader, his friend, I think, Dave, who's at the heart of much of this. And I acknowledge thousands of businesses stepped up during the pandemic. That was a good thing, and we celebrate that. The difference is they didn't all have the chance to text the Prime Minister, ask him to fix the tax situation in exchange for doing that. That's the difference. At the heart of this scandal are people's jobs and wasted taxpayers' money. Take, for example, the thousands of jobs at Liberty Steel that are on the line, in Hartlepool, in Rotherham and elsewhere, following the collapse of Greensill Capital. The Prime Minister hasn't fixed that. In fact, he's done nothing to help steelworkers. Is it now, quite literally, one rule for those that have got the Prime Minister's phone number, another for everybody else?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he calls it a scandal. He voted for the changes that we brought in. Our ventilator, he called our ventilator challenge an outstanding success, and I think he was completely right. This is a government that gets on and delivers for people in distress and delivers on the people's priorities. And yes, of course, I'm concerned for the families of steelworkers up and down the country. That's why the Business Secretary has been meeting with the unions and with the management of Liberty Steel repeatedly over the last few days. But we believe in British Steel, Mr. Speaker. It was under the last Labour government that jobs in steel fell by more than 50% and output fell by more than 50%. We've now got a 5 million tonne pipeline of British steel with our massive infrastructure investments, and we intend to use our new freedoms under Brexit to make sure that procurement goes to British companies, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Well, he says we believe in British Steel. Well, do something. I have to say to the Prime Minister, steel workers waking up this morning will find it deeply offensive to hear the Prime Minister boasting to his friends that he's the First Lord of the Treasury and we can give you the backing we need. He won't give the steelworkers the backing that they need. Mr. Speaker, this shows once again that favours, privileged access, tax breaks for mates, they're the main currency of this Conservative government. And if that's not the case, Prime Minister, can the Prime Minister tell me if one of the 3 million self-employed people who've been excluded from government support for over a year and now face bankruptcy, if they text the Prime Minister to ask for a tax break so they can survive, would he change the rules for them too?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've given, this government, I should say, has supported the self-employed with more than £14 billion throughout the pandemic, and that's as part of a vast package of support for jobs and livelihoods across the country. We continue to do everything it takes, and I think that he should take back what he said about the ventilator challenge. He attacks the ventilator challenge now. Our efforts to get more ventilators at a very, very difficult time for this country. In the same way, Mr. Speaker, by the way, in which he opportunistically attacked the vaccine task force at a critical moment, which he will recall. Mr. Speaker, we take the tough decisions that are necessary to protect the people of this country and get things done.
Mr. Speaker, if I had to correct the Prime Minister for everything he gets wrong, I'd be here all day. I take it that's a no as an answer to the question in relation to the 3 million. And there we have it. An open door, but for those with the Prime Minister's number, a closed door to the 3 million. What this shows once again is the extent of the sleaze and cronyism that's at the heart of his Conservative government. Let me try another way, Prime Minister. Let me try another way. If an NHS nurse, Prime Minister, who's been working on the front line during the pandemic, had the Prime Minister's phone number, would they get the pay rise they so obviously deserve?
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of what this government has done to support the NHS throughout the pandemic, with record investments and with another £92 billion that we put in to support the NHS throughout the pandemic. And what we're doing to help nurses, as he knows, is last year putting in the bursary of £5,000 plus the £3,000 on top to help them with training and the costs of childcare, a 12.8% increase on starting salary just in the last couple of years, Mr. Speaker. And above all, this is the government that is helping nurses and helping the profession by recruiting more than ever before. And there are already 50,000 more people in the NHS this year than there were last year, Mr. Speaker, and 10,600 more nurses. That's what I'd say to many of the nurses that I've talked to in the last few days and weeks, and we will continue to back them to the hilt.
Yes, Starmer.
If the Prime Minister had been talking to the NHS frontline, he'd know just how insulted they are by his pay cut after everything they've put in the last year. They didn't get a text from the Prime Minister. They got a kick in the teeth. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, there's a pattern to this government. The Prime Minister is fixing tax breaks for his friends. The Chancellor is pushing the Treasury to help Lex Greensill. The Health Secretary is meeting Greensill for drinks. And David Cameron's texting anybody who'll reply. Every day, there are new allegations about this Conservative government. Dodgy PPE deals, tax breaks for their mates. The Health Secretary owns shares in a company delivering NHS services. Sleaze, sleaze, sleaze. And it's all on his watch. With this scandal now firmly centred on him, how on earth does he expect people to believe that he is the person to clean this mess up?
Prime Minister, I'll tell you why. Because I'll tell you why this government is doing the right thing at the right time. Because the difference between us and the Labour Party is I'm afraid, staringly obvious. And we get on with taking the tough decisions to protect the people of this country and to take our country forward, uniting and leveling up. We take the tough decisions to procure thousands, tens of thousands of ventilators in record time, which apparently he now opposes. We put forward tougher sentences for rapists and violent criminals, Mr. Speaker, which he then opposes on a 3-line whip, Mr. Speaker. And we take tough decisions to stick up for the fans, of our national game. Captain Hindsight snipes continually from the sidelines. This government gets on with delivering on the people's priorities, Mr. Speaker.
Philip Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Back in 2019, the government gave the Labour Council in Bradford hundreds of thousands of pounds to carry out a feasibility study for Shipley Eastern Bypass. It was due to report in the autumn of 2019. They put it back to April 2020, and yet a year on from that, there is still no sign of it. Please will the Prime Minister intervene to ensure this vital infrastructure project is delivered? And will he meet with me and our honourable friend, the member for Keighley, to see how we can progress our campaign to break away our constituencies from Bradford Council to set up a truly local unitary authority to deliver for our constituents?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on the second point, I'm sure the relevant minister will be happy to meet and to consult him. But on his point about the Shipley bypass, the matter is currently with Bradford Council, and I suggest that Labour-controlled council follow the example of many Conservative-controlled councils and deliver that essential infrastructure project on time, creating jobs and opportunities for his constituents.
Let's go to the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition on both the Queen's 95th birthday and the justice that we've now seen in the George Floyd case. Mr. Speaker, this morning's revelations surrounding the Prime Minister's interference in COVID contracts are incredibly serious. Whether it's cash for questions in the 90s or text for contracts during this pandemic, people know this is the same old story. This is how the Tories do government. The Prime Minister is at the very heart of this scandal. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister reveal today how many more COVID contracts he personally fixed? And if he has nothing to hide, will he publish all personal exchanges on these contracts before the end of the day?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course, there's absolutely nothing that to conceal about this, and I'm happy to share all the details with the House, as indeed I've shared them with my officials immediately. Mr. Speaker, and it's thanks to that immediate action that we've been able to roll out, and not just to deal with the ventilator challenge, but also to help the people of the whole United Kingdom to get access in record times to the vaccines on which we all depend. And I think what the people of this country, and the same goes for rolling out PPE, Mr. Speaker. We've had to work at incredible speed, and I think the people of this country understand that it is sometimes necessary to act decisively to get things done.
Let's go back to Ian Blackford. Ian.
If the Prime Minister says there's nothing to see here, publish them. Let us all see them. Let's have that transparency, because frankly, his excuses just don't stack up. Last March, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor had all the time in the world to fix contracts for a cosy club of friends and Tory donors, but didn't have any time to support the millions of self-employed. Those 3 million people didn't have a David Cameron or a James Dyson to text the Prime Minister for them. They were on their own, and they were left behind by this Prime Minister. This Tory text for contract scandal is growing more and more serious with every revelation. the Prime Minister was eager to initiate an inquiry into his predecessor, David Cameron. Will be as quick to commit to a public and comprehensive inquiry into himself and his own government?
Politics, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he says we had all the time in the world. In fact, as the House will recall, at the end of March last year, the pandemic was taking off very fast, and we had to act very fast, as I think people up and down this country understand. And I thought that his dog just made a more sensible contribution just now than he did.
Faye Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Farmers in Brecon and Radnorshire have worked tirelessly to give us world-class British food throughout the pandemic. In return, the Welsh Labour and Liberal Democrat government have given them a slap in the face with their nitrate vulnerable zone policy, which will do nothing for water quality and ignores the water companies dumping thousands of tonnes of sewage into our rivers. Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister agree with me that this demonstrates Welsh Labour's absolute contempt for rural areas like mine?
Yes, she is entirely right, Mr. Speaker, because agriculture is, of course, devolved in Wales, and if people want to send a clear signal and they want change in the way farmers are treated in Wales, and I hope they will vote Conservative in the Welsh Assembly elections in just 2 weeks' time and vote for a party that actually champions agriculture and believes in it.
Let's go to Sir Geoffrey Donaldson. Sir Geoffrey.
Prime Minister, I was proud to put on the uniform of the Crown and to serve with tens of thousands of men and women from our armed forces and our police in protecting the entire community in Northern Ireland from the ravages of terrorism during our troubled past. The Prime Minister gave a commitment in his election manifesto to introduce legislation to protect those men and women from vexatious prosecutions. Will the Prime Minister stand by and honour that commitment?
Prime Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman very much for, first of all, for his service, and I know that the whole House will agree. And I want to put on record, by the way, Mr. Speaker, my thanks to the former Minister for Veterans for all that he did to help with improving the lot of veterans across our country. And we have protected many veterans with the Overseas Operations Bill. There is more to be done, as he rightly says, in the case of veterans of the Northern Ireland conflict, and we will be bringing forward further measures in due course.
Let's go to Ian Levy. Ian.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since 2019, Blythe Valley has benefited from significant investment for levelling up, including the Towns Fund, the Future High Streets Fund, and the reinstating of the rail line. We know now that Blythe will be the home of the UK's first gigafactory, developed by British Volt, further demonstrating the commitment to build back better. Can I congratulate my friend on his drive and commitment to help in areas which have been neglected for so long, and ask him to assure the House that he will do all that he can to help those areas realise their full potential. And I would like to offer my right honourable friend an open invitation to visit this fabulous constituency of Blythe Valley, where I'm sure he will receive a very warm welcome.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend very much, and it was only lately that he and I stood on the seafront of Blythe, and we looked out at some of the incredible wind farms and just the harbingers, the prelude of the huge Dogger Bank wind farms that are going to be built in the North Sea. I'm delighted that a gigafactory for batteries is being established in Blythe Valley, and thanks to his help and his leadership, we are seeing Blythe Valley and many other parts of the North East at the forefront of the green industrial revolution, delivering high-wage and high-skilled jobs across our country.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, hundreds of GMB gas engineers were sacked for refusing to sign new contracts, expecting them to work harder and get paid less. Fire and rehire Abuses by rogue employers are spreading through workplaces like a virus. The government has called the practice unacceptable and bully boy tactics, but refused to take action to ban it. I'm giving the Prime Minister the chance to show us all where he stands. Will he commit here and now to include proposals to end this shameful and immoral practice of fire and rehire in next month's Queen's speech? Yes or no?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
I repeat what I've said about that practice, and if she'd be kind enough to send me particular details about the case that she mentions, she raises, I will be happy to take it up.
Dr. Ben Spence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Access to superfast broadband is critical in today's society, but many people living in Runnymede and Weybridge can't access it. And while this question is essential viewing, my constituents may struggle to watch it streaming at home this evening if someone else is catching up on the MasterChef final. Does my right honourable friend share my ambition that everyone in Runnymede and Weybridge should have access to superfast broadband, just as every house should have access to water and electricity?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and he's entirely right, and that's why we've massively accelerated the rollout of gigabit broadband, superfast broadband and gigabit broadband, and coverage of reliable gigabit broadband was just 9% when this government took over. It will be 60% by the end of this year, and we're driving it up across the whole country, uniting and levelling up and unleashing the potential of the entire of the UK.
Thank you. Day after day, we see more corruption come to light. Yet day after day, I speak to more desperate constituents who are excluded from this government's support. People who've lost livelihoods, homes, businesses built up over the years and been unable to put food on their table. And yet it seems all they needed was the Prime Minister or Chancellor's phone number. Frankly, I'm ashamed on behalf of this country. So will the Prime Minister and Chancellor now take the calls of my constituents in Cardiff North and meet with me and them to discuss how they can rebuild their lives after losing so much?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of the rollout of the ventilators, 30,000 that we delivered from scratch. I'm proud of it. I'm proud of the decisions that we took. I'm proud of what we did, criticised by the Labour Party, to roll out vaccines at record speed. I'm proud of what we did to support the people of this country throughout the pandemic with an overall package of £407 billion to support the people of this country. And this country will bounce back all the better and all the stronger because of the strong economy that we ensured that this country had going into the crisis, which would have been impossible, Mr. Speaker, under a Labour government. And that is what she should tell her constituents.
Andrew Rosner.
Mr. Speaker, I was deeply concerned at the weekend following reports in the Sunday Express that the statue of the great United States President Ronald Reagan, which once stood in Grosvenor Square, has been removed and remains out of public sight. I know the Prime Minister will agree with me that President Reagan was a true friend to the United Kingdom, who, alongside Margaret Thatcher, ended the Cold War and supported Britain during the liberation of the Falkland Islands. Now that our American friends have moved to a new embassy in Wandsworth, would the Prime Minister agree with me that President Reagan's statue should be moved to a more prominent location on Parliament Square so that visitors from home and across the globe can honour this remarkable man?
Prime Minister.
Did you notice, Mr. Speaker, how the benches opposite recoiled the idea of the recapture of the Falkland Islands, when you've just heard an honourable member say that she was ashamed of her country, Mr. Speaker? It is no wonder that people take that kind of attitude. I think that he's entirely right in what he says about President Reagan. I think he was a very distinguished president. It's not up to me to install a statue for him. I think that's for the Greater London Authority. I think he has to appeal to the current Mayor of London, or let's hope there's a new one to do justice to the memory of Ronald Reagan.
Let's go to Dr. Philippa Whitford. Philippa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Polio, a disease that kills and maims children, has been eliminated in all but one region of the world due to the incredible work of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. In 2019, the UK International Development Secretary pledged £400 million to the programme, as he said to do otherwise would risk a return to thousands of new polio cases every year. So will the Prime Minister now reassure the House that he will honour that commitment?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the Global Polio Eradication Initiative has been backed by £1.37 billion in UK aid since 1995. And as she rightly says, there are many proud successes of that programme and polio across the planet, very largely thanks to the help of the British taxpayer, has been almost eliminated.
Let's go to Saki Bhatti. Saki.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased that common sense has prevailed and that all 6 English clubs have now committed to withdrawing from the European Super League. Does my right honourable friend agree that if we are to protect the beautiful game further, football clubs must put fans at the heart of their decision-making?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I do, Mr. Speaker, and I think that one of the most worrying features about the European Super League proposals is that they would have taken clubs that take their names from great famous British towns and cities, English towns and cities, and turned them just into global brands with no relation to the fans, to the communities that gave them life and that give them the most love and support. And that was, in my view, totally wrong, to say nothing of the lack of competition. And it's entirely right that my honourable friend, the member for Chatham and Aylesfield, will do a root and branch investigation into the governance of football and into what we can do to promote the role of fans in that governance.
O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will be aware that opinion polls continue to show a majority in favour of Scottish independence. Does he agree that one factor is the fact that we've been lumbered with a Prime Minister who thinks that £1 spent in Croydon is of more value to the country than £1 spent in Strathclyde?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think what the people of Scotland need is a government and administration in Scotland that spends the taxpayers' money in Scotland better and more wisely, because the results, I'm afraid, of the Scottish Nationalist Party are dismal. They're failing on education, they're failing on crime, they're failing on their taxation policies, Mr. Speaker, and no wonder all they can talk about is another irresponsible referendum and breaking up this country.
Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recycling is one way in which we can all individually tackle the climate crisis. Will he join me in congratulating West Sussex County Council on recycling 53% of their household waste, a level that's almost double that of neighbouring Brighton Council?
Yeah, Mr.
My honourable friend draws attention to a very valuable and important point, which is across the country, Mr. Speaker, it is Conservative councils that keep your council tax low, overwhelmingly, and deliver better services, such as recycling. And he's absolutely right to laud the efforts of the Conservative-led council in West Sussex, Mr. Speaker.
Let's go to Carl Turner. Carl.
In a recent Conservative Party political broadcast, the Home Secretary claimed that only Conservative police and crime commissioners are responsible for increasing police officer numbers. Yet Humberside's Police and Crime Commissioner, Keith Hunter, has put well over 500 additional officers on our streets since 2016, the largest proportionate increase in the country, and was doing so well before the government pledged to reverse their own cuts. So will the Prime Minister take this opportunity to do the decent thing, correct the record, and congratulate Keith Hunter from taking Humberside Police from the worst performing force to one of the best in his time as Police and Crime Commissioner?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid I don't wish to be to sound like a stickler for accuracy here, Mr. Speaker. But since becoming Humberside's PCC, which is my normal position, Mr. Speaker, as you know, since becoming Humberside's PCC in 2016, the force has recruited 434 officers. Of these, 129 have been recruited as part of the government's 20,000 drive. And Mr. Hunter himself praised the government's police recruitment strategy, saying the government's target had lifted officers' numbers in Humberside above 2,000. So I think it'd be fair to say that Mr. Hunter's efforts, however laudable they may be, would have been impossible without the determination of this government to recruit more police officers and put them out on the street.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When my right honourable friend visited the West Midlands earlier this week to meet with our brilliant Mayor, Andy Street, was he aware that the Mayor has increased by sevenfold the investment in transport, and we now have 108 new shiny carriages for the cross-city line? What advice does my right honourable friend have for my constituents in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield on May the 6th?
Ball's on the penalty spot. Come on, Frank.
Mr. Speaker, and not only is he rolling out 50 new stations, Mr. Speaker, but 150 miles more of track, linking up communities across the West Midlands, delivering job opportunities, delivering growth, delivering hope for the West Midlands. And that's why I think the people of the West Midlands should vote for another term for Mayor Andy Street.
Let's bring in the goalkeeper, John Speller.
I shall decline that invitation as a West Midlands voter. But the Prime Minister earlier said he would use new freedoms to ensure that they buy British steel. And over the last year, the difficulties with PPE provision and vaccine production has demonstrated very clearly the risk of neglecting British production capacity, let alone the impact on the prosperity and levelling up agendas. So, Prime Minister, will you now instruct government ministers, civil servants and other public bodies that when purchasing goods and services, they must buy British first?
Prime Minister.
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker, and look at what we're achieving. Because since the PPE crisis began, since the pandemic began, we've turned things round. We've procured 32 billion items of PPE, and 85% of it can now be made in this country, which was completely impossible before the pandemic began. Look at what's happening on vaccines, where we've got the Valneva factory in Scotland. We've got Novavax in Teesside, which is going to be absolutely indispensable for our future success. And those investments will not only help us to protect our country against pandemics for the future, they will help us to drive jobs and prosperity for the long term across the whole of the UK.
Order. I would like to update the House on some news from the House of Lords.
The Prime Minister able to end Prime Minister's questions on a slightly more upbeat note in what was a difficult session for Boris Johnson. He was under an awful lot of pressure and he looked cross and rattled at times when Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was putting his questions to him about those text messages, those exchanges between the Prime Minister and James Dyson, the businessman. In response, of course, Boris Johnson said that it was in the middle of a pandemic. He did what any government would, of course, do. But there is no doubt that Keir Starmer pressing the bruise of sleaze, the Labour charge that has emerged over the last few weeks, and putting Boris Johnson very much at the centre of what he called this scandal. Let's introduce our guests. Nigel Huddleston, Minister in the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. Welcome to you. Lucy Powell, Shadow Business Minister for the Labour Party. And, of course, Laura Kuenssberg is still with us. Under some pressure.
Yeah, I think he certainly was. And if you had to sum up PMQs in 6 words, you'd have sleaze from Keir Starmer on one side, and then the Prime Minister saying, ventilators, ventilators, ventilators. You know, he kept trying to return to this memory that we all have of that moment in March when the government was really scrambling to try to make sure, quite understandably, very importantly, that the NHS would have what it needed with the threat of the illness and the pandemic being so incredibly severe. But clearly, this is an issue that Labour has got its teeth into, and clearly there are very real questions here. because the rules that govern how ministers are meant to behave apply at all times. They applied during the pandemic, just as they apply now. And although the government did suspend some of the normal sort of procurement processes, they didn't suspend the way that ministers are actually meant to behave. We all know what those principles are. They're about integrity, openness, transparency, and Labour has very much got the bit between their teeth on this. Interestingly, the Prime Minister did, in answer to a question from Ian Blackford, the SNP leader, he appeared to promise all correspondence around all COVID contracts. He said he's got nothing to hide. And remember, both the Prime Minister and Sir James Dyson said they've done absolutely nothing wrong here. But the Prime Minister's made quite a commitment there. We'll have to see whether the government really feels able to deliver it, because last night when we put this story to government, Number 10 at that point was not going to publish the Prime Minister's text. They would not tell us whether or not he told officials what was going on at the time.
Right. I should just say at this point that Sir James Dyson, who is the businessman involved, who texted the Prime Minister, has said in response to this story that he was merely seeking to comply with the rules and that he's hugely proud of the work his company did to make ventilators last year. He says that actually his company lost £20 million. But let's return to the issue at hand, which is the direct access that he had to the Prime Minister. He had his personal phone number. Nigel, is this an acceptable way for a Prime Minister or any minister to behave?
Well, as the Prime Minister said, he was trying to move heaven and earth in order to respond to a national crisis. And I think most people in the country completely understand that. And as you said, you know, at the end of the day, Dyson lost money out of this. I believe the text exchange was in relation to following up on a letter that he sent to the Chancellor. And of course, the outcome of all of this was legislation, which of course went through scrutiny of Parliament. So the Prime Minister said he's not going to apologise for doing everything he could to deal with the national crisis. And I think most normal people will understand that.
Right. Well, if it is acceptable, as you have said, can I take it that if a businessman or woman sent you a text message directly asking for help with his or her tax affairs, you would reply to them saying that you would fix the tax issues for them?
Well, I think it's really important that government does engage with industry all the time. And I have had hundreds of meetings over the last year doing so. But as I said, the key point here was, if you remember, this was in response to a letter in which I think James Dyson very clearly laid out in the letter as well. He was asking not just for his company, but it was a policy issue on behalf of several industry sectors. And he was chasing a response. And in the really important times last year, which remember, everybody does remember this, of course, we needed to move very quickly. But there was no question about the process or the legislative outcome.
No, but I'm talking about the sorts of access that some people have to very senior, I should say, politicians, in this case, the Prime Minister. Because in response to that, Boris Johnson said in his text to Sir James Dyson, "I will fix it tomorrow." That's a direct quote. So I put to you again, if somebody texted you, would you return and respond to them saying you would fix their tax affairs for them?
Well, I don't think that's, I think you're framing that in a very odd way. And as I said, he was asking on behalf of the policy issue that would apply to multiple sectors. But in terms of would you respond in the middle of a national crisis to somebody who's offering help for things that were desperately needed to help with that crisis, I would expect my Prime Minister to bend over backwards to try and make sure they got a result. Now, if Keir Starmer's saying he wouldn't have done that and he would have gone, "Oh, no, I can't talk to you. Thanks for your offer of help," decline it, then that's something for him to explain. But I think the Prime Minister did the right thing that the majority of people in this country will completely understand.
Well, and that's true, isn't it, Lucy? Because we understand that actually Boris Johnson called up James Dyson. He initiated the contact, asking for help when it came to ventilators. Are you saying Keir Starmer would have responded differently if he'd been in Boris Johnson's situation? That if he was Prime Minister during a major pandemic and he had an urgent need for life-saving equipment like ventilators, and he got a text from a businessman prepared to make those ventilators for the NHS, if he got help or reassurance with his tax status, that Keir Starmer would say no?
Well, look, I think you've got to separate out some of these issues here.
Well, what would he do in response?
Of course, you would expect a Prime Minister in that time of crisis to do whatever it takes to encourage and support British industry to help meet the demand of the time, whether it be ventilators, PPE, or hand sanitizers, or feeding hungry school children and so on, as thousands and thousands of businesses around the country did during
So your answer is
that
yes,
time.
Keir Starmer would have done exactly the same, whatever it takes, you've just said.
Okay, but I think there's a very different and separate thing, which I do think people can appreciate, which is then subsequent to that, a very wealthy Tory doning business person who happens to have the personal mobile phone number of the Prime Minister. Because, by the way, when the Prime Minister first reached out to him to seek his support, as he did with other industry leaders, he would have done that via his private office and through a withheld number and so on. He wouldn't have had, other people wouldn't have had his personal mobile number to then effectively ask for a tax break for helping the country at that time of crisis. A tax break he only needs because he had, in the very recent past, decided to offshore the head office and the R&D component of his British-based business at that point. He decided to offshore that because that was more tax effective for him.
But Lucy,
so,
Lucy,
you know,
can I just be... Yeah, I understand what you're saying, and you've taken us through the various stages, but the question that I'm asking is, would Keir Starmer have agreed to fix, James Dyson in this case, tax issues or not? Either he would have listened to the lobbying and got the ventilators manufactured, or he would have ignored the lobbying and lost out. Which would he have done?
Well, that is just, you know, you really are kind of making this sound like a very sort of a trade-off here, which I don't think it is in that way at all. Any Prime Minister, Keir Starmer included, should not, under the ministerial code, be taking personal lobbying from a business business person to their private mobile phone and responding saying, I'll fix it. No Prime Minister should be doing that. And Keir Starmer absolutely would not.
Right. Well, can I just then at this point play you one Labour politician...
The point about whether you would do whatever it takes to ensure that British industry... British-based industries that choose to pay their taxes in this country normally anyway, would then all pull together to try and deliver the ventilation programme. Of course you would, and you would do that through the armoury of government, and you would do that in an appropriate, transparent and proper way as speedily as possible. That is very different from replying to a Tory donor who's a billionaire that you will fix their tax returns as some kind of trade-off for them supporting the country at a time when, frankly, I think most people watching this programme would expect those business people to support the country.
All right, well, let's take a listen to one Labour politician who actually has been Prime Minister, because Tony Blair gave his view on this story this morning. Let's have a listen.
I mean, as I say, I don't know anything about the facts of it, but in the present situation, in the middle of a global pandemic, you're trying to do everything you possibly can. It doesn't particularly surprise me that there were I'm sure there were other direct conversations between ministers and people who, you know, you wanted to help in fighting the pandemic.
Tony Blair there. Laura, it is this direct access, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And it was interesting hearing the minister there sort of try to kind of explain it away, because the ministerial code, the rules that are meant to govern the behaviour of ministers, does say that basically if there's any kind of private approach, they're meant to tell officials absolutely straight away. And because this has all been rumbling around for ages, last week I asked quite a few government ministers how they deal with these kinds of approaches when they happen. And they sort of said various things. Well, you tell your private office straight away. One of them told us that they take a screen grab of messages immediately and send it straight onto their private office in order that there can be absolutely no suggestion of any impropriety, any private favours, anything that looks like it may be untoward. And I think that is really the issue here. I think many people in the public will absolutely think, look, this was a completely unprecedented national emergency, but it doesn't mean that the rules about how ministers behave when they're making decisions about billions of pounds of government money and millions of people's lives, it doesn't mean that those rules just go completely out the window. And it's interesting to bring in what happened with Greensill. David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, has acknowledged that doing things by text message and informally approaching ministers was not quite the most appropriate way to go.
All right, just before I go back to Nigel, Lucy, are you surprised by what Tony Blair said?
Well, I don't agree with what he said. You know, I speak to business people every single day, and I have done intensely during this whole pandemic. And you know, what's been so heartwarming is how much British business really has stepped up to the plate over the last 12 months. Many of them supporting their staff, closing their businesses, doing whatever it takes. Others, as I say, providing free school meals, providing free hand sanitizers, free PPE and all sorts of things, switching their businesses at great cost to them. They don't have a direct line into the Prime Minister to sort their tax affairs out. They have to go through the channels that everybody else does.
We should remind people, though, that Dyson lost £20 million in this project. The contract in the end did not go ahead, but also in that, particular context of all of this, it is this question of the direct private access and how you get that kind of thing. And the problem for the government is it gives this impression that you get, if you can text somebody if you're in the know, then you can benefit from it that directly.
Well, Nigel, did Boris Johnson break the ministerial code by sending those text messages?
Look, the Prime Minister said he'd do anything he can in the national crisis.
But did he break the ministerial code? It's there for a reason.
I don't know the full details of exactly what went through official channels, but I do know that in terms of the outcome, I think people are trying to present this as some kind of conflict of interest. There wasn't a conflict here. There was a result in that Dyson lost money, and in terms of the outcome, the policy had to go through normal channels through Parliament. So this is quite an extraordinary situation, but it was extraordinary times. But I can tell you my personal experience is that civil service and ministers act meticulously in these cases and are extraordinarily careful to make sure we go through due process.
Right. Well,
these were really exceptional times where things were moving.
I know, and of course that is the justification that you and other ministers will continually use. But just for our viewers, the ministerial code, which guides what ministers can do, it's the rule book, says very clearly that if a minister ends up discussing government business without an official or civil servant present, then anything significant should be passed back to the relevant government department as soon as possible after the event. Now, you say you're not sure, but how would you look at those text messages? Do you think it looks as if he has broken the ministerial code?
Well, I can't be drawn on that because I don't know the full details, but I can tell you that, my experience is everybody is meticulous in terms of following these processes. And in terms of the outcome, my understanding was the texts were relating to a chasing for a response to a letter, and then a letter did come, and we went through normal processes afterwards.
Right,
so, there's not a lot here in terms of trying to present some kind of special deal or conflict. There was a request that applied to multiple industries and sectors, which ended up in Parliament with normal parliamentary scrutiny.
Right, there is a question about whether Boris Johnson really understands the ministerial code and whether he really takes it seriously, or that not only is there one rule for business people like Sir James Dyson, but there's one rule for Boris Johnson.
I don't think that's the case. In terms of how things go through Parliament, there is an incredible degree of scrutiny. And I think this government has never, no government in peacetime has gone through the scrutiny like this government's gone through. We try to be as opaque as possible, or as clear as possible, rather. We're trying to be as really constantly having ministers and people on TV screens all the time. We're constantly answering questions. So,
Minister, we're obviously always very pleased when ministers are willing to come and talk to our viewers like you are today. But if the government really cares about this kind of issue, why has the vacancy for the advisor on ministerial standards, in other words, the person who's meant to police all of this for Downing Street, why has that job vacancy not been filled for months? And why did the Prime Minister then completely ignore the recommendations of the former advisor in that particular situation when he was looking at the behaviour of one of his colleagues, the Cabinet Minister, Priti Patel?
Well, look, in these times, it's not very easy to fill a lot of posts, actually, because there's a lot of things going on. But certainly that post is still available. We'll be pursuing that. And of course, I say in this context, let's not forget that the Prime Minister has announced an investigation here as well. So, as I said, going back to this point of trying to be as transparent and open as we can, there's multiple examples how we're trying to do exactly that.
All right, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about the European Super League that isn't going to happen by the looks of it. Lucy, do you think the government really helped put pressure on the 6 English clubs to back out of the plans?
I think the pressure from all of us really helped as local MPs, as cross-party MPs, as the football establishment, and I think most of all, and particularly, as the fan base, and that united front that was put on across the whole country really did have quite a big impact. And it's good to see that has led to a change of heart from these clubs.
Right. I mean, Nigel, does this episode show that elite football in this country is broken and now needs fundamental reform?
Well, we committed in our manifesto and announced this week that we will be conducting the fan-based review of football governance, which will look into a whole range of issues, including the financial flows. But I think the lesson this week is, ignore fans at your peril. The fans have been great. They made their views incredibly clear, and the government made clear from minute one that we stand shoulder to shoulder with fans. So there was fan power here.
Right. Well, should we move to a so-called German model where football clubs are controlled by fans?
Well, it's very telling, wasn't it, that actually the German clubs were not included in this deal. And perhaps one of the reasons for that is because of the structure of football and ownership of football, where fans have a much bigger say in Germany. So we'll be looking at all of these alternative models over the next few weeks and months with the review that Tracy Crouch will be leading. And she's somebody, of course, who commands the respect of both sides of the chamber, and as a former sports minister, knows the sector intimately. So we'll be looking at all of these things. I don't want to preempt the outcome of the review, but it will be a pretty comprehensive review.
Right, Laura?
But, Minister, as someone who's worked in business before government, who's now in the sports department, why do you think it might be justifiable, or do you think it would be justifiable for the government to sort of interfere in this way in what, at the end of the day, is actually a business? Now, it's something that people have huge sentimental attachment to, but is it something a Conservative government ought to be doing, rewriting the rules for one kind of business?
I think the thing with football is that it is a community asset, and it's almost a bit like a heritage asset. It is something that, even though it's privately owned, the community, the fans, believe that they have an ownership stake as well. And that is broadly recognised across a lot of Europe as well. So they are in a very special place. It's rare that you get things dominating both the front and the back pages, but football is one of those things that happens to, because there is this feeling of ownership from the fan base who've put their sweat and their emotional support into making these clubs over the years, and feel that they've got real stake in the game.
Right.
And that's not the case in every other sector. So I think there is something genuinely quite unique about football, many of whom have got a 100-year-plus legacy in their local communities. So they are different, and I think most people understand that.
Right, well, Boris Johnson does seem to have had a sort of change of heart, if you like, because we're going to play him from 2005, when he's talking about probably the most controversial foreign takeover of a football club in recent years, which was the sale of Manchester United to the Glazer family back in 2005. Let's have a listen.
I don't want to intrude into Manchester United's private grief or to offer any more profound opinion that, than if a chap wants to buy Manchester United. I think it's basic Conservative philosophy that he should be allowed to buy it. Okay. And I wouldn't want to stand in his way.
What would I say to the billionaire club owners? These clubs, these names, originate from famous towns and cities in our country. And I don't think it right that they should be somehow dislocated from their hometowns, home cities, taken and turned into international brands and commodities that just circulate the planet.
Well, what a contrast, Nigel. That was Boris Johnson at the press conference last night. Who is the real Boris Johnson?
Well, again, we can have overseas ownership of clubs. There's nothing wrong with that. We've actually benefited considerably from international investment in our sports, a variety of sports, not just football, over the years. But the thing is, it has to be consistent with fans. I mean, we have an owners and directors test, and I say the review will also be looking at the future of that. But I say in football, you can't move a million miles away from the fan base. I mean, if you do that, you're destroying the very brand in which you've just invested in. So it doesn't make commercial sense either. So I think there's nothing wrong with private investment, international investment as such. But I say, in anything with football, move against your fans at your peril.
Right. Well, Lucy, would Labour move to the German model that we talked about, a fan ownership of football clubs?
Well, we've been calling for a fan-based review of football for a number of years, and it was a great disappointment that the government it's taken this, really, for government to actually move on that, and we're now finally seeing it. And this certainly does have to be a watershed moment. But I think there is a wider point here, which you were alluding to, which is maybe just because it's the zeitgeist of the moment, and there was such a huge public groundswell of opinion that the Conservative Party has broken with its own ideology to say that it will intervene in what they perceive as being a market, a business market of football, when it isn't. It is a lot more than that. It is about our heritage, our culture, our way of working, and the assets that the football clubs are of much bigger importance to our country. But the same could be said for British industry like steel and other things, which the government seem hell-bent on not intervening in. Doesn't have quite the same public zeitgeist as it does at the moment.
Sorry to hurry.
They do still have an ideological issue here.
Well, I'm sorry to hurry you along, because we said we would talk about it, and that is the briefing room, the £2.6 million briefing room. We can show you some of the pictures. There it is. What's it going to be used for?
It will still be used for ministerial briefings, so you'll still see the Prime Minister, Chris Whitty, Patrick Vallance and other ministers popping up to use that. What it won't be used for is sort of, American-style press briefings that were promised, lauded with a fanfare. I have to say the fact that these are now not going to go ahead is a surprise in the Westminster Village to almost no one.
Right. Nigel, what's it going to be used for? It's going to just sit empty?
Well, I mean, transparently, it's not. I mean, you see it used nearly every day at the moment, and it will continue.
At the moment,
a couple of times a week, perhaps.
It will continue to be used, and as you well know, actually, the two of you in particular, the previous facilities were absolutely not fit for purpose, particularly in the digital age. So there's a desperate need for an upgrade. It will be used, and it's been built at a fraction of the cost, for example, of the last refurb of the US White House. So actually, I think it's good value for money, and it will be used in future governments as well.
OK, 10 seconds. Lucy, would Labour use it?
Well, it's a waste of money when the rest of us are being told to tighten our belts. The government don't seem to have the same problem just spending the money.
All right, that's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of you. Bye-bye.